Реальний історик, це перше. І ви казали історик, я теж вас доповню, не історик, а публіцист-історик, або історик-публіцист-трибун. Бо історик пише історію після 10-15 років, а ви пишете історію, яка відбувається зараз. Я вам дуже вдячний, що ви класний публіцист.
Це був комплімент, а не критика, щоб ми добре зрозуміли. Прошу, Мирослава.
Добрий день, я дуже дякую за ваші публікації. Я їх читав в англійській мові і просто захоплювався. Ви належите до тих, хто дав нам можливість боротися з інформаційною війною з боку Росії. Моє питання таке. Колись у час моєї молодості вважалося, що Росія може вижити, існувати сама, а Україна без Росії не виживе. На цьому тлі стався 1991 рік, коли Росія була переконана, що ця незалежність, яку утримує держава, вона довго не протримається, і всі повернуться знову до російського кошика. Реальність виявилася, і, до речі, на цьому Росію core nation всього цього простору. Виявилося сьогодні, що Україна після Майдану спокійно може існувати без Росії. Але Росія без України, і як виявляється, не може. Вона не може збудувати свою імперію. То що тоді? What about core nation? Дякую.
Ще одне питання, прошу. Прошу. Що робиться з дівчатами?
Моє питання дуже коротке. Політика президента Рейгана. Президент Рейган tried to just... він хотів зоряні війни і так далі, економічно трошки приборкати Росію. Можливо, з тим, щоб Радянський Союз, з тим, щоб, на мою думку, найкраще було б, щоб Росія розділилася на незалежні країни. І раптом президент Рейган злякався і допомагав Росії відновлювати економіку з певного часу, що стало причиною зміни американської політики. Президента ще навіть Рейган.
Ми поки що скінчимо перший тур і тим.
Okay, so the relationship between Russia and the Maidan is something that Russians themselves are going to have to work out. It seems to me that the fundamental question here is the question not of the Maidan as a revolt, which is that's how Putin sees it, I think, and how he portrays it. An organized revolt, organized by us, of course, organized by the Americans. An organized revolt against a legitimate existing order. But of course, that's not what the Maidan actually was. The Maidan was resistance to a decision of a Ukrainian government at a certain time, and then a defense of dignity, and then a defense of rights. So what the Maidan, in my view, really amounts to is that thing which East Europeans in the 70s and 80s called civil society. A defense of the rule of law. The justification for which is, if the state is not predictable, then society has the right also not to be predictable, which is basically what Thomas Jefferson said about the right to revolution. If the state is not bound by law, then the population has a right to rebel. That, I think, is the truly dangerous thing for Putin and for the current order in Russia. Putin's regime is not going to be overturned because the Americans organize a revolt on Red Square. That sort of thing is so far away from our possibilities. or our desires for that matter. But there is a threat, I think, to the Russian regime from civil society. And that, believe it or not, I'm answering your question. Because I don't think there can be a Maidan in Russia without there being people who would not be Zhirinovsky, right? I don't think Zhirinovsky organizes a Maidan. Zhirinovsky or someone like him could come to power in a palace coup, which I think is very possible, but not as a result of the Maidan. If there's going to be something like the Maidan, that means there are going to be other kinds of people who presumably will have other ideas about power. Which isn't to say that I'm not worried about Russia. I mean, I'm much more worried about Russia than I'm worried about Ukraine, and I'm quite worried about Ukraine. The way things have gone in Russia in the last 8 months makes it much harder for there to be a peaceful transfer of power after Putin. On the remarks about Publicistica and Historia, I agree that they're different things. That's why it's so difficult to do them both, and why, for me, it has to be a very important subject for me to try to do it. What I tried to write about Ukraine in the last 8 months, I did because I thought it was extremely important. But it's hard, because being a historian is one thing, and trying to explain history to a public is something completely different. You use different language, different kinds of analysis, and it's inherently awkward. So I'm going to try to agree with the spirit of the question. I agree that it's different to be a publicist and to be a historic. Those are two different things. There are people who have been able to do it, like Timothy Garton-Ash, for example. And the argument I'm trying to make is that some of the skills that you learn being a historian might help you be a better writer for larger audiences. The third question about can Russia do without Ukraine, can Ukraine do without Russia? This too has been very much on my mind, and it's one of the reasons that I'm concerned about Russia, because despite appearances, or despite what we believe in the West, I think the current crisis is much more about Russian national identity than it is about Ukrainian national identity. Ukrainian national identity is, of course, a question. It's certainly a question in Luhansk and Donetsk. It would be foolish to deny that. But I think Russian national identity is a much bigger question. It's a much bigger question because the answer that's being provided now is a negative answer. So who is a Russian? At the moment, who is a young Russian? A young Russian now, again, this is just my personal experience, but a young Russian now tends to be someone who says there's no Ukraine, right? And also it's someone who tends to say that the United States is behind everything that happens in the world. Now, those are negative definitions of Russia because they don't provide anything about what Russia really is, right? It's a position about the way the world works, but it doesn't tell you what Russia is. And they're also negative in the sense that they don't give you a starting point for discussion with anyone else. So if, my young colleagues in Petersburg say, that Snyder, is there really a Ukrainian nation? I can try to talk to them about that, but I think young Ukrainians would not even find that an interesting subject, right? It's like, is there a moon that circles the earth, or does night follow day, or, do you play soccer with your feet, right? If you can ask the question, but it's not an interesting subject for conversation. And in that sense, young people in Russia and young people in Ukraine are increasingly in different intellectual worlds. Likewise, the position, America is behind everything that happens, or America caused the Maidan, you can say that, you can believe it, but you can't really have that conversation with Americans because we know how slow and how inefficient and how, in many ways, weak our foreign policy has been in the last years. So you can say that. You can say, you Americans are behind everything, but you can't have a conversation with us about it because we know just how wrong it is. And so in these ways as well, it's a negative position because it isolates Russians from the rest of the world. These are what we call non-starters. You can't start a conversation with these positions. So I am worried a little bit that you're right, that in some sense Russian identity is depending upon denying other people their identity, which delays the moment of when you decide what Russia actually is, which I think is the big unasked question in all of this. Everyone takes for granted that there's a Russia, of course, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, etc. But what is Russia really? And what does it mean that in order to be Russia, you have to invade another sovereign state? That seems to me to be the big unanswered and frightening question about all of this. Ronald Reagan, why did he change policy? I find that interesting, too. There were always two sides to Reagan. and I say this not as an expert, simply as an American observer, there were always two sides to him. There was the utopian side, and there was the practical side. He had many utopian ideas, like the Berlin Wall should fall. He also thought we should all get rid of all of our nuclear weapons, including the United States, including the Soviet Union. That was a big utopian idea. He pulled back from that one as well. So I think Reagan always had two sides. There was the idealist side, and there was the realist side. The other thing to say is that what you're talking about really took place under the first Bush administration. And I think we, at that time, in 1991, 92, we lacked the imagination to imagine what the world would be like without Yugoslavia, without the Soviet Union. So our impulse was to try to deal with the people at the center. And in the case of the Soviet Union, we thought this reasonable person, Gorbachev, has come to power, so let's try to deal with him for as long as possible. And that didn't prepare us for what was coming next. So once you decide you're going to deal with this reasonable person, you're going to try to keep him in power, then it follows from that you're going to try to keep the whole thing together. And so we weren't really prepared for what was coming next. So that's the best I can do. I mean, I'm not an American diplomatic historian, though. I'm sure there are people who can answer your question better.